discuss today. How do we meet the immediate needs of our community while also working to undo the system that requires us to create food lines, to create pantries, mutual aid, community aid in the first place? If we truly believe another world is possible, then anti-capitalism can't just be a moral stance. It has to also be a practical one, a path of action that we pursue together. About me, my name is Reana Kovalcik. I am a writer, a food and farm policy organizer, and part of the collective that is the Metro DMV Democratic Socialists. I've been involved in social justice work for most of my life in one way or another. Over the years, as I moved from Chicago to New York City to here in DC, I worked on federal policy and local policy. I supported protest movements and community movements. And I met and learned from other leaders like the amazing women on today's panel. In the course of that work and education, I started to notice some pretty glaring disconnects between types of advocates or types of advocacy. But in those disconnects, I believe anyway, there lies an opportunity to do better together. I often encounter folks, for example, who either believe that it's all about the on-the-ground programming, it's all about the mutual aid or the community pantry work, or they believe that it's only about the policy work, federal or bust. If you're not doing policy work, you're not doing the real work. But it's one or the other, or one over the other. But the truth is, in my opinion, that both of these approaches have to work together. On the ground advocacy or policy advocacy alone are not enough. They're only effective when they're paired together. Of course, we have to address immediate needs, but we also we can't be so focused on the problem of the day that we forget to ask the important question, which is, why are we here in the first place? Why are we on the line, the food line, the pantry line? What system created this and continues to perpetuate it? So today, I want us to explore through conversation what the socialist scholar Eric Olenwright calls eroding capitalism. We can think of eroding capitalism as a culmination of many different approaches to dismantling the capitalist economy and rebuilding in its stead a solidarity economy, one in which our worth is not measured by our income or our paycheck. So there are many different approaches to undoing capitalism. There's taming, resisting, smashing, escaping. And each of these is actually really important, as important as the next. The radical feeds the practical. Mutual aid addresses the immediate problem so that community members can focus on bigger, on like overarching things like policy. They all work together. I'm excited to discuss tonight how we can erode the harms of capitalism by fighting against what harms us, for what heals us, and acknowledging that caring for one another is in fact a political act. So I hope that sets the stage for this conversation. David is going to keep track of questions in the chat. We'll hold most of them until the end, but David or Rachel, any of the admins, feel free to interrupt if you feel like there's a question in the chat that would really help steer the conversation. We do want this to feel conversational. And now I'm going to kick it over to the panelists to introduce themselves to you and sort of frame their work in their own words. So Diana, can you start?
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for having me here. My name is Diana Ramirez. I'm a fellow in residence at the National Women's Law Center, where I focus on job quality as a racial justice issue, gender justice, economic justice issue. And before being at the Law Center for 2 years, I was a senior policy advocate at the Restaurant Opportunity Centers and led the local ballot initiative for one fair wage. So I am happy to be here to discuss the tip workers, justice, and how, like you said, Rihanna, how we erode at that system or chip away at that system. Should I go into my discussion now, or are we just doing intros for now?
Intros, and if you want to do any, stage setting, if you want to sort of set the framing for your work, I thought we would each do that. But we'll kick into like the full body after each person goes. So either way, if you want to give a little bit of setting the stage for the work that you do, otherwise we can go to Trupti for her intro.
Yeah, I can do some quick framing. Some of the background that goes into the work that I do at the National Women's Law Center, focusing on tip workers. The history of the tip minimum wage, I think, is very important to understand for this conversation. It for those of us who have been servers or have worked at a restaurant, you know that there's a lower wage for folks who get regularly. The cutoff is actually only $30 a month in tips. If you regularly get $30 a month in tips, then your employer is legally allowed to pay you less, depending on the jurisdiction. At the federal level, it's $2.13 an hour. And this practice of tipping proliferated in the US after the Civil War, when the restaurant and hospitality industries, exemplified by the Pullman Train Company, hired newly freed slaves without paying them base wages. And the effect was to create a permanent servant class by shifting the responsibility of paying them a wage from the employers to customers. And the FLSA, the Fair Labor Standards Act, did not ensure any base wages for tip workers until 1966. And 25 years after that, we've reached a whopping $2.13 an hour. So that is some background, some framing for the discussion on tip minimum wage. And then I'll go into a little later on how we can keep working towards that at the federal and local levels.
Great. Trupti, do you want to jump in?
Good evening, everyone. I'm Trupti Patel. I go by the pronouns she, her, hers. I'm the lead DMV organizer for the nonprofit civil rights organization called One Fair Wage. So Diana Ramirez and I actually met during the local One Fair Wage battle, which is known as Initiative 77, which Metro DSA actually played a huge part in helping to win. And so I was actually, at that time, I was actually a tipped worker that, basically went against her fellow brothers and sisters in the industry, or was made to appear that way for, basically pointing out the flaws of a very racist and fragile system. And, we won it at the ballot box. And then 4 months later, in September/October of 2018, the DC Council decided to overturn my vote. So when they overturned my vote, I didn't get mad. I got elected. So I ran for office, and I am the District of Columbia's first Indian American woman advisory neighborhood commissioner. And so now what I do is I amplify the injustices of the tipped wage worker system. I address industry labor rights, and I just cause a lot of trouble. And that's kind of like where I come in. Like, since the pandemic has happened, I have been basically, for the most part, been trying to keep people alive. And, I've been doing that through various means, through basically using my platform as an elected official to kind of like push against government agencies to point out the flaws of the capitalistic system. Why should I have to prove to you that I deserve this, and how it has like just carved out people, and that, like this system that everyone keeps wanting to embrace and keep in place, like, does so much more harm than help. And, we're right now at a very pivotal and critical position to, really take down this system and actually rebuild it in a manner that actually serves all of society.
Thanks, Trupti. I just want to do a quick check to see if Kaya was able to get on. I do see one or two things without a name, so if that's you, please speak up. All right, I'm so sad. Hopefully, Kaya Parker is also meant to be here today. She's been having a lot of tech trouble, so hopefully she comes on and can jump into the conversation. She, if you don't already know her, is the founder of Kyanite Kitchen and Kyanite Pantry. The kitchen is sort of her culinary arm, her business arm, and the pantry is the mutual aid work. They work across wards, are doing amazing things for the community, have been the place where I have been doing most of my mutual aid volunteerism, have been learning a lot. She's been doing amazing things for the community, leading the way on so much, and really serving as a hub for a lot of the small and large mutual aid groups and some of the nonprofit actors to really connect everyone together. And yeah, we've done some amazing events together that have been so rewarding. So hopefully she's able to come in on the phone or on video. Otherwise, I will try to do my best to represent the sort of the mutual aid side of things, which I'm sure is what many of you came for. So I hope you won't be disappointed. I will still talk about that. So one of the first things I wanted to talk about was going to go to Kaya, but I think it can go to everyone, and I'll address some of it, which is how diversity breeds strength. So some of what I said in the intro was, about these two sides, which I don't think they are just two sides of the coin. It's like a 20-sided coin, but mutual aid, direct on the ground work, and policy advocacy, working together, so needing these different approaches. And I think we see that also within our spaces. So, I found that there is a ton of diversity between movements, and also within them. Movements meaning like between the labor community and between labor and policy or community aid, all of those things. In the mutual aid work that I have done with Kaya and with others, I find that people are coming from tons of different walks of life. They're there for different reasons, and people that are being served are also really diverse. They're coming from a lot of different communities. So I think Trupti and Diana, you can kind of speak to this as well. I would love to talk about why that diversity, both within movement and between different movement sectors, how that helps us breed strength. And then I also want to talk about the phrase solidarity, not charity, which I think a lot of folks have heard, and discuss maybe what that means to all of us. So I can weigh in too, but Diana or Trupti, do you want to speak to those themes?
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that and provide a little more framing too. So, this is solidarity has to be intersectional, right? We can't we can't help food service workers who are also struggling without looking at who or any person really. If we're trying to better our lives and improve our communities and help each other up, we have to look at who we are holistically, and not just, certainly not just how much money we're making, but the realities of living in a capitalistic society is that, like, a lot of the times it does come down to that. And while we're working to change that system, we have to make sure that people get at least a living wage. And so if we look at, so we gave a little bit of the history of the subminimum wage that was supposed to create this permanent servant class. And after 25 years, we're still at $2.13 an hour at the federal level. Now in June of 2019, the House of Representatives voted for the first time in history to give tipped workers the same cash minimum wage as other workers before tips. And it was included in the Raise a Wage Act, along with the $15 minimum wage. And then it was included in President Biden's COVID relief bill, the American Rescue Plan, and approved by the House. But as most of you know, it was taken out of the bill by the Senate parliamentarian on a procedural rule. But we do have examples of states that have moved to higher wages, and they did it right from the beginning when they first set their minimum wage laws, or they've later moved towards that, but they certainly stood in solidarity with their workers. And a record-breaking number of jurisdictions will raise their floors in 2021, but there are 7 states that already have one fair wage. And just for those of you who might not know the term, that's what we call pay when employers pay tipped workers the same cash wage from the restaurant before tips. So the idea is that if you're a tipped worker, you get the sub-minimum wage, and then tips are supposed to make up the difference. But if you don't know your rights, if you're maybe not from this country, if you don't know the language, and even if you are born here and you know the language and you know your rights, when you're covering 6 tables on a busy Sunday brunch, you're not going to remember to write down all your tips and all your hours and then go to your boss and say, hey, you owe me money, right? That's unrealistic. You're more likely to just go get another job at another restaurant that may or may not treat you better. So there are 7 states that already pay one fair wage, so that they get the full same minimum wage from their employer. And those states are Alaska, Oregon, Washington, California, Nevada, Montana, and Minnesota. And 26 more states and the District of Columbia have a little bit higher tip minimum wage at the federal rate, but it's still under $5 an hour. And so those of you who live in the district who were here in 2018 may remember what Trupti and I already brought up was DC Initiative 77, which was a ballot initiative for one fair wage, and it passed with 56% of the vote. Now, over 70%, so if you look at the wards that supported the Initiative 77, wards 7 and 8 were the highest wards that had the highest support for the ballot initiative, with over 70%. And not 3 months later, the council overturned it. So the folks who stand to benefit the most from an increased wage came out and voted, and actually the ballot initiative received more votes than the legislators who were on the same ballot. And those same legislators got reelected, and then they said, oh, but people didn't know what they were doing when they voted for Initiative 77. So we're gonna go ahead and overturn that. Wait, but they knew what they were doing when they elected you? Like how do you say that in the same sentence, right? So then the council overturned Initiative 77, and they pretty much buckled to the pressure of the Restaurant Association, funded by the National Restaurant Association, what we call the other NRA. And if you just look at Chairman Mendelson's campaign finance reports, that election cycle, he got 30 times more money than the previous election cycle from the Restaurant Association and their members.
Diana,
So,
can I cut in a little bit?
Yeah.
I just want to see if Trupti can speak to maybe some of the organizing, because I don't want to dig too deep into Initiative 77. I think it's important that we cover that ground, but I don't want to get too in the weeds of it. If you can't tell, we kind of have a bit of a food focus. So we both have hospitality and then food community aid. So that's kind of going to be a running theme. We're going to be very focused on food, hospitality, food service, and those sort of things. But Trupti, I would love if you can take the information that Diana has given us on this effort, because you are also part of this effort. And I've been part of many of your rallies and organizing activities, and talk maybe about, like, again, how is this solidarity, not charity, carried through? And like, how is solidarity with, not just other hospitality workers, but other groups, like, why is that relevant to the work sort of succeeding and being uplifted?
Certainly. And, a lot of the stuff my colleague Diana Ramirez had laid out, I was just kind of setting up like the tone of like what I as an organizer and what our worker members are up against. I mean, literally the 3 things I hear from workers are, I don't know how I'm going to pay my rent, I don't know how I'm going to eat, and I don't know if I'm ever going to work again, period. And I think when you hear that, and all of this has shifted in the way that I the pandemic has shifted in the way I organize, because now I have to organize not around like an issue someone cares about. I have to organize around how do I meet the needs of this worker who is in a life and death situation. And the parallel of how mutual aid comes in is that I'm able to rely on mutual aid, like the solidarity and the actions that people may think like, oh, like whatever actions I do in mutual aid don't have an effect. Like, no, you do, because what, like, you've now become a trusted source and entity that I can send very, very vulnerable members to go get food. I have people who are classified as undocumented workers, which means either like because they were formerly incarcerated, they don't count for funds from the government, or if they don't have papers saying that they're legal in this country, they can't, are carved out, or they're not part of the cash formal economy. And one of those ways another a group that I've kind of fallen in with is street vendors. Street vendors are actually, former restaurant workers who,
Yeah.
couldn't take the abuse and the toxicity anymore and decided, you know what, I'm going to go do street vending work. I'm going to make food and I'm going to sell it to you directly on the street. And, street vendors started realizing like they're stronger when they started pairing up with me. And then when we talk about like, okay, you know what, like we're excluded out from all these programs, we're starving, we're hungry. And then, you go in, it falls into the cancel rent movement. If someone who's classified as an undocumented worker or an excluded worker, I'm sorry, let me say it that way, an excluded worker can't afford their rent. That means my other member who is, perceived as having all the benefits is also suffering that same way. And so this is how like full intersectionality plays in, is because we're starting to realize like we're all fighting for the same thing, but in different ways. And there's strength in numbers. And, when you start realizing like, mutual aid, what I do and what Diana does, even though we're 3 separate entities on the outside, but as we will all talk and hear about the efforts mutual aid does, what I work on, what Diana Ramirez, like there is very much a deep overlay. Like I may be on, like straight on the ground, but Diana Ramirez can call me and say, hey, I need you to come in to talk to this US senator, because like I have the ability to tie and weave in all those themes to a US senator or to a US member of Congress and say, this is how we shift policy. And, and we are able to effectively point out the flaws of the capitalistic system.
Yeah, and I want to point something out. So going back to this idea of eroding capitalism and this concept from Eric Ollenwright that I'm really in love with, mutual aid is sort of classified under escaping capitalism, which means like you've just exited that toxic system and you're doing something totally different through the solidarity economy. And so it's meeting a need, but it's not taking apart the system that created that need. And so that's where things like dismantling come into play, which I think is like the actions that we're talking about here. And I want to uplift something. So last year I worked for the city council on labor issues. It was the most trying year of my life. The DC Council, but I worked with Trupti quite a lot, and I want to sort of just call out something that I think is really intersectional and speaks to the idea of policy plus mutual aid or community, which is that Trupti was supposed to give testimony for a hearing we were having, and she was like a little bit late, and she came on the video, and it was like kind of a rough start. And it was because she was like, I brought one of my workers with me. This person was supposed to sign up for this panel. And they had, Trupti, if you want to speak to it, you can, but like they had some kind of issue where like they didn't have the resources or they were given the wrong information. And Trupti like swooped in and I think went and got this person and brought them in and was like, this person is sharing my time with me because it's important that they speak. And I think that kind of care is so political and so important. And I don't know if you want to elaborate on like those kinds of actions any further, Trupti. You don't have to if you don't want to, but like that to me, I was just like, that's full advocacy. That's both like, I'm at this official hearing and I'm doing this official thing through the policy process, but also I'm like here for community. And I'm like literally going to like get this person and bring them into my Zoom window.
So it's actually funny you brought that up, Reana. And so I'm actually in a similar situation like that. And I think that is one of the reasons why I've become such an effective organizer, because my worker members know, like, I'm going to make sure like I put them before a member of the council. I'm going to make sure that there's a little bit of fairness in a system that's always been so stacked against them. So like the latest battle I'm involved in, I just got roped into, is I'm battling to keep 800 low-income seniors in their housing. There are a group of developers that have approached my ANC commission to say, hey, grant us this exception. We're going to take care of them. We're not going to displace them. They've not addressed any questions. And they basically said, oh, like anything you want to know is not that important. It'll come later. And I kid you not, like they tried to pull a vote without announcing it. And me and my fellow colleague, literally stood our ground, refused to like cede 1 inch. I mean, it got to the point we were shouting at one another, being like, no, like you can't do this. And, you know, and it just, and the reason why I'm using this example or telling you about this is, you know, there are people who will never want to work in the interest of the people. And, you know, and because I literally said, like, the people who matter in this discussion, you're not even listening to them. And I said, like, I'm not going to allow a vote to carry on. And, you know, I think, you know, in any of the work that we do, whether it's mutual aid, whether it's policy, advocacy, organizing, trying to figure out how we intersect, it's trying to figure out how we center the people we're fighting for to be at the helm of this movement. And that is what I've always tried to do. And I think one of the reasons why I was so excited to be a part of this panel is, you know, like you see how much of a grip capitalism has on everything. Like, we're talking about mutual aid and food and how people are starving. And then on one side of the economic sector, farmers are dumping out milk, they're smashing eggs, like there are like literally slaughtering animals because they can't get them to, you know, they can't get them to like the meat packing farm fast enough. So they rather like destroy and get rid of stuff rather than saying, you know what, we know people are hungry, let's not make a profit, let's just give it away. And you know, and I mean, for me, it's kind of like, yeah, this isn't the good aspects of capitalism. And it's very funny how capitalism is trying to get mutual aid to become capitalistic. Like there's like these movements that are trying to say, well, let's formalize mutual aid, but then they want them to emulate the same toxic processes, you know, that mutual aid is trying to get away from. So like, that's what I've been finding very interesting.
I think that's actually a perfect segue. So one of the things I wanted to talk about is going back to this like bifurcation or that some of us may experience. And I think having been on the policy side and been on the protest side and been on the mutual aid side, I've seen a lot of that bifurcation. And I would be interested if, you know, Trupti, I think you definitely can. Diana, you probably have experiences too. If maybe you can talk about, you know, why you think there might be some dissonance between the types of work, especially, you know, given you all are working on policy stuff, but then there's also the on the ground actions, the showing up for the rally, the mutual aid work. You know, what do you think sort of causes that disconnect? You know, I think it's mostly on the policy end where people, there's a lot of communities that are just really distrustful and they're like, I'm not working in that system. Like, that's not important to me. Like, I'm gonna do the march and I'm gonna do the mutual aid, but I'm not gonna testify for the council or whatever. So I would love to hear, you know, thoughts on like, why do you think that disconnect might exist?
I can start, Trupti, and then maybe you can give your thoughts. But I think I think restaurant work is seen as unskilled labor for whatever reason, even though it takes the most skilled person to deal with, you know, to provide that type of professional service. But if you're getting paid $2.13 an hour, you're not, you know, how can your employer say you're a professional? How do you say, you know, you're treated as less than, you're paid as less than, and therefore this must be an unskilled job? And so we'd start there. It starts there, and then the majority of tipped workers in this country are women. Almost 70% are women, and the people who are making the decisions are not women, right? And so you have that disconnect between this is unskilled labor for women, and that's where it starts. And so when you see, you know, when you even with the COVID relief bills, even under Trump, a lot of restaurants got relief money to serve meals, to become these mutual aid providers with government money. And the people that were serving were their own employees, you know. And I want to uplift Chef Jose Andres was on a panel with One Fair Wage a few months ago, and he, admitted he was against One Fair Wage pre-COVID, but post-COVID, he said, the reality is that this, the injustices are happening right here in our backyards, in our restaurants. It breaks my heart to, and I'm reading a quote, it breaks my heart to know that many of these meals we are serving to those who cannot feed themselves, or the people who share an industry with me, the restaurant industry. The best way, he said, people don't want pity, they want our respect. The best way to give them respect is by, then he goes off, by supporting the Raise the Wage Act. But this is exactly, what it is that this is seen as unskilled labor. And when you're paid $2.13 an hour, how do you, you're often treated as such.
Yeah, and I think you like encapsulated sort of solidarity, not charity, in a different way, right? Like solidarity is like actually respecting those voices, not just using these people as props. And it for me really connects. Trupti, I would love it if maybe you can speak about, because again, you're working on national projects, but you're focused on the local level. And having worked with you at City Council, you're often asked to bring people to a hearing, to get a witness, to get testimony. And I'm curious if you've encountered, when you're trying to talk to workers or talk to your community, what that resistance looks like. If you encounter people who are like, I just don't trust this process, I don't want to be part of it, I don't the policy process to me is like not one that I want to engage with. Have you had that experience?
I'm really glad that you brought that up, Reana. I think what's tough to talk about, and I've become more public and vocal about it, is it's not that workers don't have a vested interest, or like just in any movement that people don't have an interest. It is that when you are in that situation and you are the one, while you're in it, start telling the truth about that situation, there is almost like there's this retaliation and this anger from the very people you're trying to help. And it's almost the best way a member described it. They were like, they called it Stockholm syndrome. And it's kind of like these people all rage about how toxic this system is, but at the same time, they don't know anything else. And the least little bit of disturbance or the attempted shattering of this toxicity, sends people into panic attacks. I've had workers tell me that yes, they support this, but they don't want to be visible. And because they're afraid that if they become visible, they become targets for retaliation, not only from their employers, but potential future employers. They're afraid that, if they become visible, that they're going to get doxxed. And what I mean when I say doxxed is that somebody from the public will release like that person who went public's like address, email, phone number, where, they can actually suffer, acts of violence against them, or get threats of violence against them. And, and it takes a whole lot of courage for people to come forward. And so there's already when that person comes before the council, it is so intimidating for them, because, they look at someone on that dais and they immediately freeze up, because they're like, oh, this person is really important. Does this person care what I think, what I say? And I have to literally say to them, the person on that dais is here to listen to you. So actually, in this moment, in this time, you're the most important person. And, so it's that's the number one hurdle. The second thing is, when people, whether you're the worker in that movement or you're just an everyday person who's asked to practice civic engagement, when you see, lawmakers deliberately ignoring, your input, your thought process, like the fight for 15, like a $15 minimum wage has over a 70% approval rate nationwide. 70% of the US public wants this to happen. And yet 8 Democratic senators in the US Senate are blocking a $15 minimum wage for all. Like, we have seen over and over again, like, a capitalistic system model has failed, particularly in the hospitality industry, with tipped restaurant workers, with hotel workers, with airline workers. You can't ask people to be like, yes, this system works, when the proof has been already shown in no unapologetic terms that it does not work.
When you've been excluded for centuries, right? Like, oh, now we need you to come. Well, wait, but I'm only worth like 213 to you. Like, why? And then when I do go out and vote for it, you overturn my vote. So yeah, it's definitely fear of the unknown in terms of changing to a one fair wage model. But in just engaging in elections or in civic participation, it is really hard when you have workers who work 2 or 3 jobs and may have a 20-minute break in between them. And what do? Do they sleep on the metro for 20 minutes? Do they go to your member meeting for 20 minutes, or do they go visit their kids for 20 minutes? Right? It's hard.
Yeah. So there are tons of barriers. And I think that you guys have addressed a lot of those. So we've talked about some of the reason there's a dissonance and why there's a little bit of a disconnect. I'd love to then talk about like how can we reduce that skepticism? How can we bring more folks in? And if anyone joined late, Kaya Parker, who's from Kaya Night Kitchen and Pantry, our mutual aid guru and leader, is having tons of tech issues. So she may pop in at some point. That would be wonderful. If not, I'm trying to hold up the mutual aid side of things. So how can we break down, those barriers and have these two super important arms of the movement work together? And I'll throw some thoughts out to start, which is that, in the mutual aid world, and I think in a lot of nonprofit work, the goal really is, or should be, to work yourself out of business. Like, we shouldn't be doing this work forever. We don't want to be doing this work together. We shouldn't have to do this work forever. It's not right. Mutual aid shouldn't have to exist if we had a system of governance that cared about us as human beings. Like, we wouldn't need to do this. I mean, maybe we would. We'd be bringing some casseroles over to, we probably would do some things. We'd still be neighborly. But I think mutual aid has just reached this epic level because we have such epic failures of this capitalist system. And that's kind of where these systems of advocacy that erode capitalism come in. They take a look at the dissonance, the gaps that a capitalist economy creates, and they solve that problem because capitalism can't solve that problem. And so in solving the problem, you kind of get that foothold, and that's how you start to erode. You latch on, and then you keep eroding. And as someone who's also done a lot of policy work, I'll say that it is effective. I think part of the struggle is that in most cases, I mean, sometimes on the local level, this is different, which is part of what's exciting about working locally. But in most cases, the change is really long. Like, I work in agriculture, the Farm Bill is every 10 years, or every 5 years. And the Child Nutrition Reauthorization Act, which is, nutrition and feeding programs for children and families, that's every 10 years. That's a long time. That's a really long time to wait for something to change in a big package of legislation. Or even if it's not that, it's like, well, I showed up at this hearing and nothing changed. So, what the hell? Like, why am I doing this and wasting my time? And I think that's another way where mutual aid or community work and policy can work together, because mutual aid, like Kaya Night Pantry, like so many other groups in the city, in the district and across the country, relieve some of that burden. Maybe they're providing a hot meal so that worker doesn't have to cook tonight. Maybe they're providing clothes or school supplies so they don't have to go to Walmart at 2 a.m. to get their kids school supplies, because that's when they finally got off work. So I think those are entree points. And then also communication, I think, is important. Again, I'll focus on the district, which is, the district, I think a lot of us would probably agree, has horrible communications. Like, if you are trying to get unemployment, God help you, because you don't know what to do. If you are trying to get paid family leave, like, how do you do it? Who knows? Like, even the agencies don't communicate in a way that is clear. And I think that's one way that that advocates can help, by breaking down. Like, here's all the mumbo jumbo, the jar, we push that all to the side. Here's what this is, here's what it does, here's what I need you to do. And like, here's what the timeline looks like, and like setting up reasonable expectations, right? Like the vote is on this day, or this is going to be a really long process, but it's important that you show up. So yeah, someone that has worked behind the curtain and on the line, it does have an effect. It's just not always immediate. So I would love to hear thoughts from both of you about like how do we kind of bridge this gap? How do we get the worker to go to the congressional hearing or the council hearing? How do we dismantle the skepticism that like, oh, that method doesn't work, or only this one is really effective?
I think it comes down to relational organizing, right? We all go out to eat. We all get brought a bill eventually by our server. At that point, if you can just engage in a conversation, engage your server in a conversation like, hey, I'm just curious, does your employer pay you a full wage before tips? And well, most of you are in the district, and so most of them won't. It'll be a little bit, maybe between $5 and $7, $10 an hour, but just engaging them and allowing the server, or informing the server that you support them, right? Like you are here to back them up. I think is one. And then a lot of the like great worker center organizations are doing that, organizing, Trupti is doing it on the ground. The Restaurant Opportunity Center is doing it on the ground. And at the end of the day, those of us who have organized before, that people get engaged because of their relationship with their organizer, because of their relationship with the person who pulled them into the movement. And it's all about those direct relationships, because the opposition is having, on the clock, pre-shift, captive audience meetings, the good old union busting tactics to put fear in their workers that, hey, if I have to be a fair employer, if I have to pay you a full wage, I'm going to go out of business, sky's falling type of thing. And so that's who we're working against, right? We're working against these captive audience meetings. And the only way we can erode at that is by just having those conversations. Every time you go out to eat and you have a server, engage them.
So to kind of piggyback off of what Diana said, and actually to give you a concrete example of where organizing literally impacted policy. So when, COVID-19 hit, I, along with thousands of people in March of 2020, lost their jobs. We were all, we were all out of luck. And so, as like, in the midst of a pandemic, our excluded, industry, folks, not just with the not with just the hospitality industry, but, the construction industry, any industry where they had a worker who, for whatever reasons, were carved out of UI benefits. We were like, our members were telling us as organizers, we're about to lose our homes. We have nothing. And here it is. There is a city full of people who have just treated us as invisible, like we don't matter. And, we're hearing this. And so we were like, well, we were like, what do you need? And they were like, we need money. We need people who are in charge to give us money. So and to affirm that we have the dignity. And so literally overnight, a coalition of grassroots it was just completely grassroots, just people who cared about other people. We started the Excluded Worker Campaign, where we asked the DC government for $20 million. And initially they tried to laugh us off and be like, you're not getting anything. We stood toe to toe with Chairman Phil Mendelson. We protested outside of his house. We were there. We were relentless. And we got $9 million from the DC Council. And then Events DC kicked in another 5 million. So we got a grand total of $14 million. But that that was the street cred that no one had ever seen ever happen, where organizers effectively mobilized a group of people so quickly, so fast, that they were able to put such pressure on the DC council and to get like another organization to sit there and say, you know what, we'll kick in some money. And and it's what made that happen is, workers got to the point where they felt, number one, they didn't have anything to lose. Like, I mean, these were people who were trying to keep their, their young kids housed. They were like, they were to the point they were like, if I may have to go to jail. So like my kid, and that's sometimes what it takes. It takes the extreme threat of, I'm going to be unhoused. I'm not going to have this. I'm not going to have that, where they're willing to like say, you know what, I'm going to go out here on the street. I'm going to get in anybody's face that I need to get into to prove my point. And, it was almost kind of like, it was this visceral response to the indifference of certain members of the council to say, well, we don't believe this kind of pain and suffering exists. And then there was these group of people and said, oh yeah, you don't think we're suffering? We're coming to your houses. And they did. They came to Phil Mendelssohn's house. They went to every single council member's houses, and they said, these are our children. We are real people. That money that you're haggling about or trying to ask to justify means my kid can go to sleep and not be in the street. And so, I always tell people, it can happen, but you got to literally captivate that energy right in that instant. And that's how you push from like, going from policy into action.
Yeah, and I think you both touched on this in different ways. I think it was Diana who said, you are in the space because of the relationship with your organizer. And I think that it could be a relationship with any sort of trusted friend. And so I would also sort of say I'm bridging the gap in the mutual aid or community world versus the policy world. Be that bridge if you can. I walk in both those worlds and I try to carry them both with me. If I am having a policy conversation, or when I was at the DC Council, I would constantly share information about mutual aid. And even if you think something's obvious, it's not. I would share information about clothing drives, and people I worked with would say like, oh, what? I'm like, this has been posted to death. How have we not seen this? But like, oh, there's a clothing drive, near me. I can bring it to Heal the Homies, or I can bring it to Good Trouble Co-op. Like, yes. Same thing when you're at a mutual aid space, when I go volunteer with Kaya and Kaya Night Pantry and do those works, uplifting opportunities and saying, hey, there's a council meeting, by the way, it's coming up. I can help you register. Here's this information. Or have you seen what Stomp Out Slumlords, which is a group, within DSA here locally that's doing housing work. Have you seen this? And so try to carry that with you. I think it's great to be that nerdy or even obnoxious friend. And I have been proud to be that person my whole life. I'm always that person that's like receiving the call, like, hey, I'm filing for unemployment. Like, how do I do it? And I'm like, well, I'll find out for you, like I'll look it up. Or like, where is this? How can I engage on this? Like, carry that knowledge with you and be welcoming and don't assume that people know things. So I think we're going to get close to the Q&A portion, which I think David will help us with. I want to throw a question out, and maybe I'll give some thoughts to it that I was going to make some of our DSA folks answer, but I know we have DSA folks in the watching that are from places outside of DC too. So I just want to throw out, like, for DSA, like as a political organization, how do we break down those barriers? How do we show up in community, in mutual aid and policy work? I've been working to lead or revitalize some mutual aid work within Metro DSA. And I think that's super important. I think to the points that you both made, you can't have credibility in those communities. You can't mobilize politically if you've never shown up in other ways. Like if you, and showing up, I think one of the best ways could be through mutual aid. Like if you want to mobilize XYZ community, well, maybe do service in that community, get to know that community, be present there, be supportive of them, be sitting at their tables instead of inviting them to yours, or sitting behind the chairs at their table and just being in their spaces. But I think it's super important to build those relationships, or even just amplifying, sharing their clothing drive or sharing the protest information. So I think that's super important. If there are other DSA folks or just folks that have thoughts about how DSA could or should do that better, I would love to hear that. So David, do you want to pop on and let us know, is the Q&A like everything's in the chat, or kind of popcorn? How do you want to handle that sort of thing?
Yeah, let's, if people can put their questions in the chat, either you or I can read them out to our panelists, including you, and we're happy to do it that way.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I saw some people had some comments, so I'm gonna look and see if there are questions. Here's some suggestions. Let's see. I know some of you are in here, and I know that you have questions or comments, so I'm waiting for you to see them.
Rihanna, I'm not sure if Gianna Barcia, if it was a question or if it was a statement. Because she talks about members of Congress not being responsive unless, like, if you're part of a larger organization. I don't know if that's a question that she's asking or if it's just a statement.
Yeah, why don't we, I think we can discuss a bit about that, but Gianna, if you want to unmute, if there's anything you want to add to that, otherwise we can, I think there's certainly a comment to be made to that statement. Give it a little moment. Okay, if you do want to pop back in, feel free. I actually have a thought about that, which is, it's often true. That's why solidarity is important. Yeah, the way that representation should function is that your vote should matter to the people you elected. It's not often the case. It's not always the case. And that's where the union movement comes in. That's why unions were formed, because laborers were like, these people don't give a shit about me. Well, maybe they'll give a shit about 10,000 of me. And I think that's where solidarity comes into play. So if you are not part of a workforce or an area of work that has a union, you can consider starting one. I think DSA might have some resources on that on the national chapter page. There are also other groups that are not connected directly to work, groups like DSA or mutual aid communities, even sort of abolitionist communities. Like, there is strength in numbers, and it shouldn't be the case that you as a voter are not heard by your elected officials, but it does help. It does help to add your voice to a larger movement and show power in that way. I see a question about Martha's Table. I have worked with them a little bit. I'm aware of them. They do amazing work, feeding. I think they also do clothing and other outreach to the community. I don't know if others have had connections with Martha's Table they want to uplift.
For me, I've not worked with them in an official capacity, but I do know that Kim Ford is their executive director, and I'm a really big fan of hers. But if someone on this in this group has a connection to Martha's Table, I think I'd be open to figuring out if there's a way that I can work with them as a local person in DC.
All right.
I think
Rachel have burning questions.
Rachel, I think, wanted to speak to your question.
Okay, great.
Rachel?
Yeah, sure, I can come up video. Is my audio okay? Great. Yeah, so I just, Rihanna, you put out that question about what can we be doing as DSA. And
will you introduce yourself too?
Yeah, thank you for calling it out. I'm Rachel, I use any pronouns, and I'm on the steering committee of Metro DC DSA. And so in that capacity, I have been plugged into a few of the different things the chapter has done, and especially in the last year during COVID, that have sort of, I think, fit in this space of, balancing between policy and kind of the mutual aid world a little bit, or the organizing sphere. And I think, it was really interesting to hear Trupti and Diana, you both speak to this, because just seeing the parallels in other spaces in our chapter where this is played out a little bit. I think a great example has been the current vaccine outreach that our Medicare for All working group has done. To be honest, when I first heard that we were going to be doing vaccine outreach, I was both very excited because it was so important, but I also had the immediate thought, this is exactly what the government is supposed to be doing. Like, where is our city in doing this outreach? They weren't present until they announced very recently that on May 1st, they'll be doing canvassing, but we've been doing that for weeks already. And this was such an amazing way to harness our volunteers, I think, and really act in this very clear, direct way of seeing a lack of sort of, in this case, just action from our politicians, and connecting directly with communities. And I've heard, just in calls with the folks who are running that, this eagerness now to sort of do this for other social services. Reana, you made the point to unemployment. There are a lot of different ways we could be reaching out to just letting people know about the services that are available to them and helping them go through that process, which is a little bit also what our tenant organizing group has been doing with rental assistance. There was a big protest a couple of weeks ago to push the DC government to actually use the many millions of dollars they'd received from the federal government to put it towards rental assistance. And then immediately after that protest, incidentally, they announced that the rental assistance website was going up. And now organizers are helping folks fill out those forms and letting them know that that's available to them, which is another just kind of exciting and also sad way that we have to plug in and use our knowledge and volunteers. And then, you all spoke to also just the being part of hearings and raising our voices in these direct spaces with politicians, which is another way over the last year we've seen some of our working groups plug in. Last summer, the Defund Metro Police Department, Defund MPD working group got stood up after the George Floyd uprisings began. And there have been hearings on the police budget, specifically the city budget largely, and doing the organizing of getting people into those hearings to testify. That's been something that our tenant organizers have done with regards to rent and tenants' rights as well when hearings have happened on those topics. So those are just some of the ways I think that we've kind of straddled these spheres a little bit, but it's so exciting to hear all of you. I mean, I think ideas are hopefully turning in all of us of like how we can continue finding these pockets where, we have organizers and we're plugged into policy, even though we are not policy people ourselves always. And, I'll say that I think, I don't know if the question about Martha's Table is directed towards like, does DSA work with Martha's Table? I think this is an interesting question that people maybe have differing thoughts on like what is the purpose of DSA and where are we in relation to nonprofits in the city and other groups in the city, and what are the best ways to connect? Should we be kind of doing the things that nonprofits can't always do as staffed organizations with boards and funding, or should we be, working on collaborations in certain ways that they can't always? So I think the fact that we are this democratic organization funded by our members puts us in this unique place that sometimes nonprofits don't have, and sometimes that means not doing the same thing, but like still finding those connections so that we can keep in touch and be working on the same things holistically. Anyway, sorry, that was a very long-winded answer to your great question, but thank you for putting it out there and you all getting the gears turning.
Yeah, no, I think you encapsulated it really well. I think you really touched on sort of some of the both andism that I was hoping we would get in this panel, which is to say, like, the vaccine thing is a great example. You're seeing a gap created by a capitalist economic system, and through mutual aid, which is more than just doing a food line, could be vaccine sign up, it can be information sharing. Through the sort of mutual aid or community action, you are filling the gap that the capitalist economy has created, and you are establishing a foothold of real trust and relationship building which you can then use to do other work in policy, to propose, ways this could be changed in the future, to break down barriers to more access in the future. And so I think it's important to exploit these sort of chinks in the armor almost. Like, capitalism creates a lot of problems and it doesn't know how to solve it. And again, I say capitalist economy because it's like bigger than just consumerism. It's also the way our government is structured and all of those things. And when we can kind of seize on those gaps, then we can build our power as a community. And I think it's also important to always keep that question you asked, like, isn't this the government's job? And the answer is, like, in this system, no, probably not. Like, this system is not set up to value that kind of equity and really help the folks that are getting, left out. So maybe not, but we could build a better system. We can build, a better system, a better world. And so I think I lost my little train there. But this is sort of the way that we do that. This is the way that we can sort of say, like, why are we, oh, there you go. Why are we doing this if the government should do it? And we can take that as a next step. We can both policy change to address that question and do the immediate work. I know people are maybe winding up, so I would love to go to we have some action items for folks and also contact info for the various organizations, including Kaya, who's not here. So I just want to throw that up. And if Diana and Trupti, you have any closing on your action items or, just parting thoughts, feel free.
Yeah, I guess I can add on to your last comment, Rana, about like, in regards to the restaurant industry, this is a moment in time where the unsustainability of their employment practices has been brought to light, to mainstream, right? And the fact that restaurants are failing and closing down is, and even now during this, even now the restaurants are starting to open up and that cities and states are relaxing their COVID restrictions, they're seeing the worst labor shortages in the history of the industry. People don't want to go back because they were exploited before COVID. And now with COVID, you have a workforce that is majority women being asked to go back to work and for low pay, less tips, and now we didn't even talk about this, but they're being asked to take off their mask the harassment is now focused on the mask, like, take off your mask so I know how much to tip you, take off your mask to see if it matches the bottom half of your body, take off your mask to see, if I